Hooday, Bengal fans. Mon will be joining us in just a second. He is Eric. I am Jake. This is the Bengals Pulse, the heartbeat of our Cincinnati Bengals. And right on cue, there he is, our guy, Mon Alban. Hey guys, we have got a very, I think it's a fun show. It's gonna be a fun show. Listen, guys, we're not being. Let's just right away. Let's get it out of the way. We're not being negative. But with all the Ring of Honor talk, guys, when we had our podcast meeting, we started putting together the kind of shows we want to do. We like, what would be fun? Let's do a Ring of Sadness show. We have the Ring of Honor. Now tonight is the Ring of Sadness. I'm gonna let you explain to all the listeners how we're going to do this. But before we do all that, we got a little bit of Bengal news. Well, not so much Bengal news, but kind of. We'll talk about that here in just a second. Before we do, guys, Mon, how's your week been, buddy? How you been doing?
Good, really good. Just excited about this show tonight. Been really getting into hockey, guys. Playoff hockey is something else. I've been a casual fan for years. And Edmonton, they're in the finals. I'm rooting for them. I live in Florida, and I want them to beat the team from Florida. So I'm excited about that. But getting closer to football season, that's my real passion. And let's talk Bengals and the Ring of Sadness.
Let's talk. Let's talk. Hey, and real quick, let's throw this out here. Mom, the Reds have a little bit of life, right? I mean, they have a little bit of life right now. 2 out of 3 from the Cubs. As bad as we've been playing, they are still in the hunt, right? I mean, the Reds are not out of this thing yet.
No, they're not. They're not out of it. But I'm always going to be a Reds fan. I root for them. I watch them multiple times each week. But I'm so down on them right now. I need to see a little bit more. Need to see a little bit more.
You know what I'm down about, Mon? They're 2-11 in one-run games. 3 years ago, they broke the record for losing the most one-run games. They're on pace to do that again. That's terrible managing. But let's not get. This is not a Reds podcast. Let's get into a little bit of NFL news. That is right, guys. All the Justin Jefferson to Cincinnati talk. We can now stop talking about that because he signs a crazy record deal with the Minnesota Vikings. 140 over 4 years, 110 guaranteed. Guys, obviously this is not Bengal news, but it is kind of Bengal news because we have 2 wide receivers that are coming up for extensions. What do you think? Let's talk about the more realistic one in Jamar Chase. Guys, Mon, I'll start with you. Where do you think this kind of correlates with what we're going to see from Jamar Chase here, maybe next year or even the year after? Is it going to be close to this deal or is it going to be more?
Yeah, if he signs, it's going to be this year or next. It won't be the year after. I'll tell you this: the Bengals will sign Jamar Chase. He's going to be a Cincinnati Bengal. I don't think the Bengals are afraid of the annual average. I think they'll give him $37 million a year. It's the guaranteed money that's going to be the hiccup. The $110 million is quite a bit. The Bengals have no problem paying that to a quarterback. The Bengals have evolved. They've changed so much over the last few years. They've really entered the modern NFL. All the criticism about the Bengals, but one knock against them, they're very conservative in structuring their contracts. They do spend money, but they just don't like the guaranteed after year 2 and 3. They're going to have to do that with Chase. He's going to sign. He's not going anywhere. They'll find a way to work it out. It's going to be a creative contract, but good for Jefferson. I'm glad for him. And all this talk about him coming to Cincinnati, it was entertaining. We knew it wasn't going to
happen. Natty Ron says, give it 4 years and he will be a Bengal. So Natty Ron restarting up. I love it, Natty Ron. Restarting up the Justin Jefferson to Cincinnati talk. Yeah, Natty Ron says he'll finish his career in Cincinnati. Eric, what do you think? What kind of implications does this have with Jamar Chase deal?
I think this is great. I mean, we all knew that Jefferson was going to get paid. There was a lot of speculation it was going to be $40 million a year, and that was really, really scary. I mean, $35 million a year is still record-setting. It's something that we haven't seen out there for a non-quarterback ever. So that's new and probably scary to these owners. I love that it happened now. I'm of the mindset that Jamar was waiting for Jefferson's deal to get done, and I'm out there with a bullhorn to the Bengals front office to get Jamar signed. Give him $1 million more a year, $1 more a year, whatever it might be. You lock Jamar up now with this same contract, and in a year from now or 2 years from now, you're going to look back and say, we got a deal. The value, the revenue sharing, everything is going up. The salary cap is going up. Lock these guys in now, and it's going to look like a steal in 2 years. So I'm happy this got done now, and we're not going to linger on. Give the Bengals time to negotiate with Jamar and get it done.
Yeah, I agree with both you guys. I think Jamar deal is definitely going to get done. I really think it's going to get done next year. I don't think the Bengals will wait 2 years for it. I think it gets done next year, and I think it's going to be right around this same amount. I mean, obviously, maybe give Jamar, like you said, a couple mil more just to make it happy. But making Jamar happy too. Will be interesting to see what they do with T. Higgins. Obviously, with Waddle signing his deal, we're seeing a lot of money being thrown around to these wide receivers. Now, Waddle, obviously, they signed him to more of a number one wide receiver deal. But again, if the Bengals are going to get this done with both of these guys, there's going to be a lot of guaranteed money dumped into that receiving core. But 110 million guaranteed is crazy for a wide receiver. I saw today, not only is he the highest paid wide receiver of all time, but he is the highest paid non-quarterback. Is that correct?
Yep,
Did I
highest
see
paid
that?
quarterback
Yes.
of all time.
Well,
So, question for
that's
both
crazy.
of you. Question for both of you. Do you think it could get done this summer?
I do. I think you mentioned it off camera a little bit before we started. I think that if the Bengals wait until next year, I think it's a big mistake. It's going to cost them more money. I know it's a different position. I get it. But Kevin Zeitler, they negotiated 2 years with him. They offered him Clint Bowling money year one, which is like $5 million a year. He wasn't going to take that. They were hoping he would. The next year, he wanted to be the highest paid guard in football, which was like $7 million more a year. And so it backfired. And they did the same thing with Jesse Bates. They offered him a contract before he set. They negotiated for 2 years, sweeten the pot a little bit. Maybe Jesse Bates, Kevin Zeitler would have stayed. I think it's best for them to potentially strike a deal with Chase this year. I think they will. I don't think they'll do it next offseason. I think it's going to get done late August. I think he'll sign his contract very similar to Justin Jefferson.
Could we steal the Chiefs opening day thunder again? Break it just like we did with the Burrows news.
Yeah. That would be great. I forgot about that, Eric.
I do think we were talking off air too. Money Mac is probably going to get done this summer as well. The Bengals, obviously, they have some money that laying around, so I definitely see his getting done. Going to be interesting to see what happens with Jamar if they do just want to get it out of the way. I do think if they get it out of the way, I do think it helps the T. Higgins situation a little bit too, right? I mean, now they'll know a little bit more about how much money they can allocate if they want to try to re-sign T. Higgins. So going to be interesting. I don't think this offseason is over in Cincinnati. We could see a couple deals getting done, including again, we talked about Evan McPherson, but what about Mike Hilton? I think he is another guy that we could possibly see re-upped here in the next couple months. So going to be very interesting. Hooday to everybody. Thank you guys so much for joining us tonight. We appreciate you guys. We want you guys to get involved tonight with this Ring of Sadness. Make sure you throw some names up there as we go through ours for this Bengals Ring of Sadness. This is going to be really sad too. Mon and I both being Bengal fans for over 40 years. I know, Mon, I'm sure we have a lot of the same guys, but it's going to be very interesting. It's going to be a sad night. A lot of bad reminiscing, but it'll be fun. Real quick, too, Max Sharping signed, right, Eric? He signed with the Philadelphia Eagles. Is that correct?
Yep. They picked him up today, so most likely we won't be having a reunion with him this year. You never know how things go with training camp and cuts afterwards, but looks like the Sharping experience the experiment is over.
Yeah, and he didn't really do a bad job for us. He really didn't. I mean, for coming off the bench and that sort of thing. But I think the Bengals have really emptied out this offensive line room and fixed it up, and hopefully more to their liking. But so Max Sharping now gone, another Bengal, ex-Bengal free agent now off the board. Okay, Eric, let's get. Did you want to say something on? I'm sorry.
No. Go ahead.
Okay, Eric, before we get started with this ring of sadness, every time I say that, it makes me laugh. Before we get ready for this ring of sadness, Eric, why don't you tell the listeners how we are going to how are we going to do this thing?
Sure. Yeah. And as Mon said before, as Jake said before, we were discussing Ring of Honor candidates, and Mon put a tweet out there a week or two ago about the Ring of Badness, I guess, or some of the worst Bengals players in history. So that got us talking, and we wanted to do a show. We didn't want to go negative with it, but you can't really talk about the Ring of Honor without thinking about all those players, the woulda, coulda, shouldas, the guys that just didn't pan out. Some of the villains, and really the opposite, the anti Ring of Honor. So what we're gonna do is throw the comments out there, name some names. Mon's got some, Jake's got some. We're gonna talk about them, debate them, and towards the end of the show, Jake and Mon are gonna select 4 to go into the 2024 inaugural Ring of Sadness for the Bengals Pulse.
Hey, we are doing this the right way, though, right? I mean, we're gonna hit it up with there's quite a few. We're gonna hit it up. But the next 2 seasons with 4, we're gonna do what the Bengals probably should have done, right?
Listen, yeah. we're gonna see the response to the episode. This is either our worst episode ever or our best, most polarizing. So you guys let us know in the comments. Tell your friends, share the episode, engage, and that'll determine if we do it next year.
Listen, guys, this is for fun. We're just having some fun here. So enjoy the show. Just enjoy the moment. Again, like he said, comment in the comment section. Let us know who you think. Mon, so we're gonna go one at a time. We just name names and talk about them a little bit. Is that what we're gonna do?
We can do that too. You guys have done a good job of already talking about it. Just make it ring of sadness. It could be, busted draft pick that just didn't pan out. It could be a free agent acquisition that didn't pan out, or it could be a player that just had an unfortunate injury history. It could be all 3 of those criteria. And I have 50 names in my head, but yeah, we can name a couple. Jake, you want to start? Go ahead.
I will start. I am. Oh, it's so hard. Let me think about where I want to start. I think I'm going to start with my furthest back. Okay, and I'm probably gonna piss off a lot of Ohio State fans when I say this. My first guy is Archie Griffin. Okay, again, Archie Griffin. We all know this guy is probably one of the greatest college football players of all time, right? 2-time Heisman Trophy winner. He won almost every single college award for 2 straight years that you could win as a college running back. But let's talk about what he did when he was drafted by the Cincinnati Bengals. Taken in the first round, the 24th overall pick. He played 7 years in Cincinnati, guys. 7 years in Cincinnati, had 2,800 rushing yards and 7 touchdowns. He did have 1,600 yards receiving and 6 touchdowns. So Archie Griffin, 7 years in Cincinnati, 13 total touchdowns. He played in 2 Bengal playoff runs. In 81. He had 1 carry for 4 yards in that Super Bowl. And again, that was the first year I became a Bengal. So the Archie Griffin thing's really kind of stuck in my head forever. And he also muffed a kickoff return in that Super Bowl in 81. 25 total yards in all of his playoff appearances, Mon, in 81 and 82. 25 total yards in the playoffs. and I think this is kind of what I did for some of these guys that we drafted. Jackie Slater, Harry Carson, and my guy Steve Largent all drafted in that same draft. The Bengals went with the hometown kid from Columbus, Ohio. Archie Griffin is my first addition name for the Ring of Sadness. What do you guys think about Archie Griffin?
Is that your selection or is that a candidate?
That's a candidate. That's my first candidate.
That's a candidate. Okay. You know what? I get it. He was a first round pick. He underperformed. He played a lot in the mid to late 70s. He sort of got lost in the shuffle with Pete Johnson, his college teammate, Charles Alexander, another number one pick. So they had a stable, Linville Elliott, who played in a couple Super Bowls. So he got lost in the shuffle there. He didn't get a lot of opportunities when he did. He did have a couple. I think he had a 90-yard run against the Chiefs, which is what was a Bengal record at that time, or 80-yard run. But you're right. For being a number one pick, he did underperform. I don't have a problem with it. Eric, what do you think?
I mean, that's before my time, so I can't really make a comment on it. I've got some guys in mind that disappointed me more, but I will not vote on this because that was before me.
Guys, remember one of the all-time running backs in college football history.
Yeah, he was. He won 2 Heisman trophies.
Yep.
I have a. No, are we going? Jake, you have another one? Or are we going? I mean, I have.
Go ahead. We'll go one at a time. Go one at a time. You go ahead, Mon. You go next.
All right. Well, there's multiple, and I'll tell you this. Let's go back to 1984. Okay. The Bengals had 3 number one picks. I'm going to pick one of them, but I'm going to mention all 3. Okay. Ricky Hundley was the first pick for the Bengals in that draft. He never played a down for the Bengals because of a contract dispute. Number 2 was Pete Cook, who was a defensive lineman from Maryland. He was a college teammate of Boomer Esiason, who was drafted in the second round of that same draft. The 3rd number one pick was Brian Blados, who was a backup tackle. He started some games. When you have 3 number one picks in a draft, they should be staples. But here's the problem. Let's go back to Pete Cook. He played 1 year for the Bengals. The next year, he was cut. When are number one picks cut in your second training camp? That just doesn't happen. That's a big-time whiff. That was horrible. But you know what his claim to fame is? He was Swede in the Heartbreak Ridge movie with Clint Eastwood. He became an actor. All right? He played like 3 or 4 more years in the NFL, but he was a number one pick for the Bengals. Oh, just a terrible whiff. Terrible. He's a handsome devil, good-looking dude. He went to acting, but that was a terrible number one pick. That was a horrible draft for the Bengals. Boomer saved it. Boomer and Barney Bussey were in that draft. If it wasn't for Boomer, that could have gone down as one of the worst drafts in Bengal history. But we got a franchise quarterback that led us to a Super Bowl. Boomer is, Boomer. But 3 number one picks, and they really whiffed on all 3 of them, but Pete Cook was the worst.
And I don't think people realize, like you said, Ricky Hundley never played it down for Cincinnati. There was a whole dispute there. The Bengals ended up trading his rights to the Denver Broncos. The Bengals did, though, Mon. They got David Fulcher and Tim McGee out of that. So they got David Fulcher and Tim McGee out of that Ricky Hundley deal. But you are right. Man, you have 3 number one picks, and you whiff on every single one of them. That is bad business for the Bengals. Like you said, Boomer Esiason really saved that draft.
Well, and on top of that, I don't know if you've heard Boomer talk about it. I was telling Mon this before. They alienated or almost alienated Boomer because he expected to be one of those first round picks. And every time they didn't select him, he got more and more pissed off. So they could have set themselves up for extreme failure there. But luckily, Boomer came in and did what he did.
You know what stinks? We're going to talk about a lot more of these what ifs and Ring of Sadness. But there's a lot of things that we're going to talk about that are happening in modern day Bengal football. And that's what frustrates me. I mentioned it earlier. They have come such a long way. They've changed their ways. The Bengals are doing an amazing job reinventing themselves. But when it comes to contracts and scouting of players, history continues to repeat itself, and they
Yes.
got to take another level. And I'm going to, Jake, you go next, but I have some more, and people are going to go, wow, that sounds like what's happening today.
I got one I want to throw in there and get your guys' opinion on, because when we originally did start this, we were going Ring of Shame or Ring of Dishonor, but we've changed it to Ring of Sadness. And to me, it's really about the biggest buts, the biggest what ifs. My number one is a Hall of Fame coach that coached for the Bengals for many years and was a dud. What do you guys think about Dick LeBeau? Horrible with the Bengals.
Go ahead,
Ends
Mom.
up in the Hall of Fame.
You start
Hall of
off,
Fame
Mom.
defensive coordinator.
He's a Hall of Fame coach. Eric, I get what you're saying there. He was a great defensive coordinator, but guys, I don't think the Bengals set him up to succeed. I really don't. I don't think they did. They drafted some players. I remember. I mean, the Bengals were signing guys, street free agents. A guy named Alonzo Mintz that played at Florida that has been around 6-7 teams, and he was a starting defensive tackle. It was just, I don't think he was set up to succeed. He's a Hall of Fame coach. You're right, though. As a head coach, he did struggle. His record is what it is. A lot of people did mention that too. That's a good one, Eric. But to me, I don't think he was set up to succeed.
And I think
he wasn't just our head coach; he was also our defensive coordinator for a few years too. So.
He did, but he's considered the father of the zone blitz. You do know that. So
yes.
The West Coast offense originated in Cincinnati, and the zone blitz was perfected in Cincinnati. So,
and some guys are just not head coaches. Some guys are just really good at coordinating one side of the ball, and I think Dick LeBeau was that guy. And like Mon said, I don't think. Dick LeBeau was in that very, very bad time of the Bengals, and the organization was not run well. I'm with Mon. I don't think he was really put in a good situation, and I think just because of all of his accolades from being a great defensive coordinator, kind of gets all that other stuff gets lost in the mix because some guys are just not good head coaches, and at the other hand, I don't think he was really set up to succeed. All right, but that is a good one.
Before you, he's a good candidate. This is the Ring of Sadness. This is the big.
It is.
Yeah,
that's a good one.
You got a Hall of Fame coach
yeah.
that couldn't make it with your team. What's more disappointing than that?
I like it.
That's fair. That's fair.
This is not off limits to anybody.
All right, Jay, give us another one.
I'm going to give you two just because they play the same position and they were both just absolute duds. And the reason why we really had bad times in Cincinnati from the 90s all the way into the early 2000s. But Achilles Smith and David Klingler are maybe not even so much two of the worst picks in Bengal history. They might be two of the worst picks in NFL history. Achilles Smith taken 3rd overall. If you'll remember, guys, he was taken after Donovan McNabb, right after Donovan McNabb. The Bengals, don't forget that draft. Mike Ditka offered the Bengals 9 picks for that spot. 9 picks. Like Ferris Bueller's Day Off, 9 times. 9 times. Offered 9 picks. The Bengals sat and picked Achilles Smith. Remember, he had that whole contract dispute. He ended up signing a 7-year contract with the Bengals. Here's his stats, guys, in 4 years. In 4 years, 2,000 yards passing, 5 touchdowns, and 13 interceptions. This is one of the worst picks in NFL history. Remember, guys, he had one great year at Oregon, blew it up. He threw for over 4,000 yards. I can't remember the exact numbers. I was pissed because Dante Culpepper was picked after him, and that was who I wanted in Cincinnati. David Klingler, 1st round, 6th overall. This was from 92 to 95. He obviously lost his job to Jeff Blake, but David Klingler in his years in Cincinnati, guys, 3,900 yards, 16 touchdowns, and 22 interceptions. Guys, are there any worse 2 quarterbacks in any team's history then David Klingler and Achilles Smith.
I gotcha. I'll say this. I agree with you on the Achilles Smith. That could easily be one of my choices. Achilles Smith just it started off. It was a wreck. The holdout, and it just didn't. It didn't mesh. But David Klinger, I want to say something about him a little bit. Yes, he's going to go down as a bust. He was sacked like 85 times his rookie year. A little bit of shell shock there. But remember when you just mentioned Jeff Blake? Jeff Blake came into the Shake and Blake really is, when he came in and started the last 8 games of that season, he looked phenomenal. Yep. But Jake, that next year in training camp, they had a battle, David Klinger and Jeff Blake. David Klinger was outplaying him in the preseason, and it wasn't close. He was lighting it up. The last preseason game, he gets hit and breaks his jaw. Never hear from David Klinger again.
Yeah.
But he could have easily won that starting job that next year because he was playing lights out. And then Jeff Blake took over and helped build Paycor Stadium. But I'll give you another one real quick. Jack Thompson was a number 1 pick in 1980. He was supposed to replace Ken Anderson. See, the Bengals are always thinking ahead. Ken Anderson's getting older. Jack Thompson did nothing. But the Bengals did trade him for a first-round pick, so they got that pick back. But those are 2 good ones, Jake. Those are 2
Jack
good
ones. Jack Thompson, I was going to talk about him, so let's talk about Jack Thompson real quick. He was – again, you kind of touched on.
Hold on, real quick, Bengal fans. We're going to talk about modern. We're going to talk about more modern people. I know we're 2 old farts talking about the 70s and 80s. We're going to talk about more modern guys in a few minutes. But go ahead.
Let me talk about Jack Thompson real quick because, again, like you said, this was the Bengals' way of thinking, and it's just absolutely insane. Jack Thompson, where was he? He was from like Washington State, right? Washington State was it? Or Washington, I think?
Yeah, it was. It was Washington, yes.
So
I think it was Washington.
So the Bengals, Kenny Anderson's on the roster, and Kenny Anderson, he had the late 70s, he was banged up quite a bit. So the Bengals go out, they have Ken Anderson on the roster, who's going to be a future NFL Hall of Famer. And they used their first pick, 3rd overall, Mon. It wasn't even like a late first-round pick. Like, it's not even like what the Falcons did this year. It's like we have Ken Anderson on our roster. We're taking Jack Thompson with the 3rd overall pick in the first round to replace Ken Anderson. And Jack Thompson never sees the field at all. Well, I think he
did. He played some.
He played 1 season. I can't remember what year it was. Maybe it was like 80 or 79. I think he played maybe like 11 games or something. That was the year Kenny Anderson missed quite a bit of games. But Mon, listen to the names that were drafted after Jack Thompson. This is heartbreaking. Listen, again, the Bengals had the third overall pick in the draft. Dan Hampton was the next pick. The Hall of Famer, Dan Hampton, was the next pick. And the Bengals used their 3rd overall pick on Jack Thompson. You know who else was in that draft, Mon? Phil Simms, Otis Anderson, Kellen Winslow, a Hall of Famer. And guess who was taken in the 3rd round of that draft, Mon?
Who?
Joe Montana.
That's right, 79. 1979.
The Bengal killer, Hall of Fame quarterback, was taken in the 3rd round, and the Bengals took Jack Thompson. Mom, that pick, let me tell you, that pick is one of the worst picks in Bengal history, maybe the worst pick in Bengal history, because it altered the entire future of the Bengals. Joe Montana ruined my childhood, Mon, because of Jack Thompson. The worst pick in Bengal history, Jack Thompson.
I don't think it's the worst. The Bengals, it was Ken Anderson's 6th year in the league, 1979. He had been hurt, broken hand. He had issues, so they drafted Jack Thompson as the eventual replacement. Obviously, it didn't work. In a weird way, Jake, I'm glad it didn't work because Ken Anderson had his best football after that. Became NFL MVP, took us to a Super Bowl. And so, it ended up working out in a weird way. And don't forget, we did trade him and got a number 1 pick from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers for Jack Thompson. So we recouped some of that. I want to throw another name out real quick. You want to talk about Super Bowl teams. In 1988, we went to the Super Bowl. Okay, so the next draft, the Bengals are picking next to last. They decided to trade out of the first round. They drafted Eric Ball, who had an okay career with the Bengals. He still worked for the Bengals as a consultant or an administrative person.
He was like a Swiss Army knife guy, though. You know what I mean, Mon?
Yeah, he was good.
Yeah,
but he was good, but
the guy. Yeah.
But the second round pick, they drafted a guard from Arkansas named Freddie Childress. Freddie Childress was a 380-pound guard. Now listen to this. The Bengals were preparing to replace Max Montoya. They knew they couldn't keep Max Montoya. Max Montoya ended up leaving a year, 2 years later to the Raiders. So they got their next guy, Freddie Childress. Guess what? The next training camp, they cut him. So remember, I told you about how Pete Cook was drafted the next year. They cut him. Well, same thing happened to Freddie Childress. It's one of the biggest busts. How do you not even make it 2-3 years to develop? He was so bad, they cut him the next year in training camp. You can't have that. And guess what happened? They whiffed in that draft also. And then the Bengals began the lost decade.
Right.
Man, there's so many good ones, but Freddie Childress, a second round pick, he's not supposed to get cut the next training camp. Pete Cook, he's not supposed to get cut the next training camp after being a first round pick. Terrible whiffs there. But, there's a lot. It's not just draft busts. There's Greg Cook and his injuries. Could have been a Hall of Famer. There's, go ahead.
Ken Hammock put in here, and this is a great one. This is another woulda, coulda, shoulda.
Oh, no. Let's not talk about that yet, because I'm going to talk about Bill Walsh, because that's on my list for sure.
Okay.
100%. 100%. It's going to go with the Joe Montana thing a little bit later. But yes, Bill Walsh is on my list. Don't worry, Ken. We're getting to Bill Walsh here, because another terrible choice in Bengals history. But we will get to that. Mon, another player. Do you have another player in mind?
Yeah, I don't want to talk draft busts. I want to talk guys that they marched out as potential starters for 3 years that were absolutely terrible. They were not NFL playing material. And the Bengal front office kept on trotting them out there. They were atrocious, absolutely terrible. One Bengal player that drove me crazy, I actually started taking blood pressure pills because of this guy. He was so bad, was tight end Dan Coates. He had the worst hands I've ever seen in my life. He was absolute. If you're watching, I'm sorry. I'm sure you're a nice man, but he was terrible. He was absolutely horrible. Listen,
Coates.
They played the Ravens one game. They played the Ravens, and they beat the Ravens like 17-14. It was a close game. And I remember Mike Preston is his name. He writes for the Baltimore Sun-Times. I read the article the next day. They go, the Ravens were lucky that Dan Coates plays for the Bengals, because the Bengals should have won by 24 points because he dropped 2 touchdown passes, easy ones. And it was, oh my gosh, man. He drove me crazy. I would have meltdowns. I would invent cuss words. I'd start cussing in Arabic. It was the worst.
I knew Dan Coates was coming. I didn't think it would be this early, but I knew Dan Coates was coming.
I'm telling you right now, Eric, I'm jumping the shark. He's one of my selections for the Ring of Sadness.
Oh,
Dan
that's
Coates.
crazy. That's crazy, Davon. All right. I'm gonna go with, and I know I bring him up a lot, but I'm gonna go with Cedric Ogbuehi. Guys, listen. This is why he is just. This is why it's so sad talking about Cedric Ogbuehi, because the Bengals actually thought that he was going to replace a Hall of Fame tackle in Andrew Whitworth. That's what makes it so bad, is that the Bengals thought, we're going to parade Cedric Ogbuehi out there to make everyone else feel better about losing Andrew Whitworth, a guy the Bengals undersold and should have signed. Guys, he started in 25 games in his 4-year career in Cincinnati, and it shouldn't have been 4 years. The 21st overall pick, Cedric Ogbuehi, has got to be one of the worst, absolute worst players in Bengals history. It's got to be.
I agree with you. Go ahead, Eric. You have something to say? Eric?
No, I was just looking up other players. I was going to throw some
No.
other names.
I want to jump in on Cedric Ogbuehi. That cost the offensive line coach Alexander his job. His film was average. You know what? He just looked at pure athletic score. He was a physical specimen. His tape was horrible. He tore up his knee in the game against West Virginia. I watched that game. They beat West Virginia in a bowl game. He shredded his knee, and then they drafted him, and that led to a little bit of a mini lost decade. The Bengals went into a downward spiral after that. Because again, what were the Bengals doing? That's our next Andrew Whitworth. Andrew's out the door. Stead's going to come in, and guess what happened? Andrew played another 6 years of Hall of Fame football. That's what gets me. When you have a known commodity, I know I'm jumping off script here. Yeah, when you have a known commodity, they're always trying to look ahead and replace him a couple years early. Well, guess what? Maybe the guy you're trying to replace still has 5-6 years of good football. I can name 6-7 Bengals that left and had all-pro careers, and the Bengals thought they were washed up, but that's another subject, another show. But that's a good one, Cedric Ogbuehi. There's so many more. Eric, throw some names out.
Well, I got a big one, and I got a few stars, some good comments here, so we'll start throwing those out here. But one of the biggest ones for me was Antonio Bryant. He was supposed to come in and replace the great Lavernius Coles, and he comes in.
Let's talk about both of them. Listen,
let's talk about them.
We need to talk about both of these guys because the Bengals go out. The Bengals go out and they sign. Let me think if I remember this correctly. Okay, so in 2009, the Bengals go out and they sign Lavernius Coles to like a 4-year, almost $30 million deal. I think it was crazy. Mm-hmm. And then Lavernius Coles had like 500 yards receiving. That was the year we lost to the Jets in the playoffs. We looked like absolute trash against the Jets that year in the playoffs. They cut Lavernius Coles and they go out and sign Antonio Bryant the next year to replace Lavernius Coles for another like 4 years, $30-something million. Each one of those guys played one. Well, Lavernius played 1 year. Antonio Bryant practiced one time. That was it. He never even saw the field.
Antonio Bryant. You know what? Somebody keeps on throwing another name out. I want to get to that in a second, but let me touch on Antonio Bryant. They signed him for like a $29 million contract, gave him $10 million up front.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Gave him $10 million up front. He had a knee injury, and he never played it down. You know what? I don't know if people realize this, but the Bengals revamped their medical staff after that season. They brought in a whole new medical staff, and I wonder if there's a correlation there. I think there was. And whoever signed off on that dropped the ball. Coles, he was washed up. He had a couple. He played okay, but his best football was behind him. Somebody keeps on throwing. Go ahead.
Come on, listen. Let me say this real quick. When the Bengals signed Lavernius Coles in 2009, he was like top 5 paid receiver in the league. The Bengals gave him that much money. He was top 5 in the league, and he lasted one season.
It was a panic pit.
Oh my god!
Well, he was coming off a 1,200-yard season with the Bucks the prior season, which back then was 1,200 was pretty high up there for a 16-game season. But the medical staff just dropped the ball on that one.
A lot of people in the chat keep on bringing up Dan Wilkinson. I strongly disagree. I disagree.
Let's talk about Dan. Let's talk about Dan. This is a good time to do it. First of all, let me say this. Cedric Ogbuehi is 100 times worse than Dan Wilkinson. I mean, 100 times worse than Big Daddy Wilkinson. It ain't even close. Mon, go ahead. You start.
No, Dan Wilkinson played 13 years in the NFL. He was a number 1 overall pick. I get it. You expect him to be a Hall of Fame type player. He played a long time in the NFL, and he was a solid defensive tackle. Obviously, he had a run-in town. Mike Brown ended up trading him. We got another first-round pick for him. But he went to Washington, and he had some solid NFL stats. Now, number 1 overall, I totally get it. But he turned out to be a solid pro. I don't really call him a bust. I really don't. He underachieved some, but he had a decent NFL career.
I'm gonna say a bust, and the only reason I'm gonna say a bust, I agree with you. I think he had a decent NFL career, but when you're taking the first player overall in the draft, the next pick was Marshall Faulk. That was the next pick in the draft. Was Hall of Fame running back Marshall Faulk. And again, I know Marshall was not big on coming to the Bengals. I don't know if you guys remember all that, but I remember there was talk about Marshall did not really want to be a Bengal and all this stuff, that yada, yada, yada. But Marshall Faulk was the next pick in that draft. And you know who else was picked? Not too far down the line was what was that? What was the 49er Hall of Fame defensive tackle? Bryant. What was his first name?
I played for the 49ers, Notre Dame guy.
Yeah, what was his
I know
name?
you're talking. I forget. I know. Yeah, he was a Hall of Famer. Yeah, you're right.
He was taken not too far. He was like the 7th or 8th pick, I think, in that draft, somewhere around there. But he was a Hall of Famer. Mr. Bryant was a Hall of Famer. I don't know if I mean Larry Allen was taken in that draft. Let me find my Dan Wilkinson stuff here real quick, just so I can throw. So for the Bengals,
Were you talking Bryant Young?
Bryant Young.
Yes.
I had the names mixed up. Yes, Bryant Young was taken in the top 10 of that draft, and he's in the Hall of Fame, man. So it's kind of when you have the same position player taken, 150 tackles and 22 sacks is what Dan Wilkinson had as a Bengal. Again, I hate the word bust, but I do think Dan Wilkinson was probably a bust. But he was still better than Cedric O'Brien ever was.
Absolutely.
Or ever.
Absolutely.
Yeah, 100%.
Absolutely.
All right, go ahead, guys. Throw another name up there.
On that note, I know we don't want to go to busts, but I mean, you can't talk about Dan Wilkinson without turning around and talking about Kajana Carter. You know, the very last times the Bengals traded up.
Yeah, let's talk about Kajana. Actually, you know what? Hey, you know what? You know who else is real quick? I don't mean to jump, but you know who else was in that Dan Wilkinson draft? Willie McGinnis was in that Dan Wilkinson draft, and he was taken, I think, somewhere in the top 20, I think. Anyways,
Hall of Famer.
Talk about
Hall of Famer.
Let's talk about Kajana.
Kajana Carter. We traded up to take Kajana Carter. Yeah. Tony Baselli was in the taken next. Steve McNair was in that draft. Joey Galloway, J.J. Stokes, Warren Sapp.
Yes. I was going to say, I remember Warren Sapp was in that draft.
Ty Law.
And the Bengals had like the 5th overall pick, and they traded that pick and maybe the 2nd round pick.
They really didn't give up that much. It wasn't
I think it was like a 2nd round pick and maybe like a 5th round the next year or something. So they didn't give a lot to move up the 4 spaces. I mean, I guess a 2nd round pick, but when you take Kajana Carter, and I remember I was at my uncle's house watching that first preseason game, and it was like the 3rd or 4th carry he tore his ACL, and it was just never the same. I mean, you know, I think that's one of those situations where I think the Kajana Carter thing was not so much that Kajana Carter was a bad pick, because I don't think he was like a bad pick. I think if you guys remember, the Bengals needed a running back. I mean, if they would have hit with that, it would have been a great pick. But he could not stay on the field. He He had the knee injury. Then what else did he have, Mon? He had a
didn't he have two knee injuries?
2 knee injuries, but I thought he had like another thing too. Maybe not.
He tore up his knee. Obviously, he
missed 2 seasons. Oh, his collarbone, right? Broke his collarbone. Wasn't that him?
He broke his wrist. He broke his wrist and knocked him out in like 8 games, and he tore up his knee. You have to flag that as a ring of sadness, as injury, because it was a preseason game. You know, he was a stud at Penn State. I don't think he was the same after that knee injury. And let's remember, this was in the early 90s. Medicine. I mean, knee injuries now. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to call him a
Hey,
bust. To me, it's a bust due to injuries. Not,
Eric,
you know,
Eric, you have to put up kids. You have to put up kid hammocks. You have to put kid
Okay.
hammocks there because I remember this that he was carted off. Put that up. Look at this mod.
yeah, yeah.
Had to be carted off because of a broken
Listen,
wrist.
there's no joking about wrists here anymore. We're not
Yeah,
going
we
to
don't
have
joke
any of
about
that bad
that.
karma. The last thing to just we'll put a bullet on Kajana Carter and move on. He is a woulda, coulda, shoulda. We gave up the number 5 pick and the number 36 pick in a time where running back was
Oh,
very
for the second
valuable.
round pick.
But the 36th pick in that draft, Curtis Martin,
A Hall of Famer.
Hall of
A
Fame.
Hall of Fame running back. Oh God, I forgot about that.
All right, we're already 46 minutes in here, so we'll probably get to
Let's
your
just do a
guys' picks
rapid
here in a
fire.
minute.
Name some
Yep.
names. We could just name a
Okay.
bunch of names if you want.
I've got some picked out here, so I'm gonna throw them up on the screen. Let's go with one of the most recent and woulda, coulda, shouldas. The Bengals took John Ross and could have drafted Patrick Mahomes. I know we don't love that guy, but go. What do you think,
All right.
Mon?
John Ross, Mon. What do you think? You want to start or you want me to start?
I don't think John Ross. He wowed everybody at that 4.22. Whatever. I think obviously Marvin Lewis did not want that pick. You could tell Marvin Lewis was not a fan. He was in Marvin Lewis's doghouse. And listen, I don't want to do the Pat Mahomes thing. 3 weeks before that draft, Pat Mahomes was a second round pick. Okay, Pat Mahomes was not a first round pick 3 weeks before the draft. He was rising up, and you know what? So people to say, "Oh, Pat Mahomes wasn't considered a first round pick until literally a few weeks before the draft." But John Ross definitely a big time bust.
It's hard with different positions, but you know who was picked in that draft, Mon? Cooper Kupp was picked in that draft. Cooper Kupp and Bengal killer himself, T.J. Watt, were both picked in that draft. T.J. Watt in the first round. I think Cooper was like the third round or something like that. Remember, guys, when John Ross had that let's see, what year was that? He was drafted in 17, right? So I think it was in 18. He had like 200 yards receiving and 7 touchdowns. That was it. Like that was his stat line. 200 yards receiving, 7 touchdowns. Oh God, he was not good. John Ross, yes. I mean, John Ross has got to be up there somewhere just because of that. And remember in 19, he had those 2 big games. They lost the Seahawks game, but he had like, I don't remember, like 150 or 60, 70 yards receiving and a couple touchdowns. Remember the Seahawks game? They lost a close one. And then the next week he came out and he had like another 100-yard day. And then 2 weeks later, he was out for the season. I mean, he weighed like 125 pounds in the first place. And the Bengals used the 7th overall pick on him. Or no, the 9th overall, I think it was, on John Ross.
I got another one in your rant. We missed something, but looking it up, I get a story from 2017 talking about how they were so hyped because he spent the off season working martial arts and training, and I think I remember Mon being hyped for that too.
Oh, Mon was hyped. Mon was hyped.
Let's go. That wasn't just a bad draft because of Abuehi. What about Jake Fisher?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that should tell you right there. I forgot about Jake Fisher in the second round. That should tell you the Bengals were, like Mon said it perfectly. They were panicked. I mean, that you lose your best tackle that you've had since Willie, and you let him go for like $2 million. You let him go. So what do? They go out, they get Cedric Abuehi and Jake Fisher back-to-back picks, and they both sucked. They were both horrible.
Paul Alexander lost his job. Paul Alexander lost his job over that.
You're 100% right.
Again, the Bengals trying to be 1 year ahead to replace players.
I want to throw this name out. Let me throw this name out, and then I'll let you go. What about Odell Thurman? Do you guys remember Odell Thurman? Odell Thurman was up for he was like the second runner up for Rookie of the Year his first year. He was suspended the next 2 years and never saw another down. What about Odell
Yep.
Thurman, Mon?
I think that whole draft is the ring of sadness. Dave
It
Pollock broke
is.
his neck the second
Oh,
year.
David Pollock.
Chris Henry, Chris
Oh
Henry
yeah,
died a few years later.
yeah.
The biggest what if in Bengal history. That could have been the greatest draft in Bengal history.
It could have
Odell
been.
Thurman was phenomenal, but you're right that whole draft is a tragedy. That draft is an absolute tragedy.
It
It
is a
really is.
tragedy. Well, I
And
mean, the Chris Henry thing, obviously, that's a tragedy in itself. I loved Chris Henry. He was one of my favorite Bengals in that time period. And again, like you said, just that was a tragedy in itself. And then the David Pollock thing, I mean, that the broken neck. I mean, what are you going to do? I mean, that's another tragic thing that you can't really put words to it with him and Chris Henry. But Odell Thurman was a whole nother ball game. I mean, this guy, if it was the alcohol abuse, then wasn't it battery? Like the second year, it was like he got into a fight or something, and he was suspended for that year. I mean, this was a guy who the Bengals at that time, guys, they needed that dude at linebacker, and Odell Thurman gave us that taste that first year. Had an incredible year, like 100 tackles, 5 picks. He was all over the field. Remind me a lot of when we got Vontez Burfict. That's kind of, I think that's a good analogy to use. Vontez and Odell, both very similar situations of guys that could have been potential Hall of Fame guys who only played 1 or 2 years because they could not get the off the field stuff right.
So we're coming up on. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Mom.
No. I agree. Go ahead, Derek.
All right, so we're coming up almost on an hour here, so we want to get y'all's final four. But before we do, just one last one for you to comment on. Mon, probably take this one first. Randy Bullock over Jake Elliott, Super Bowl winning kicker Jake Elliott.
That was catastrophic. When you think about it, though, I mean, at the time I saluted the Bengals because that Randy Bullock had a very good camp. He really did. And you know what? The coaching staff said, hey, the best kicker wins. It came back to bite him in the butt, though. I mean, when you use a draft pick on a kicker and it's close, keep the guy you drafted. And remember in that preseason, he almost made a 64-yard field goal. I think if he would have made that, he would have been the kicker for the Bengals. But, and it sort of rectified itself with McPherson and all that. But that's a very good one, Eric. That's a very, very good one. But Randy Bullock, that was entertaining names for him.
Let me throw this name out here too, Mon, because I said I was going to talk about it. But Bill Walsh, the Bill Walsh situation, Mon. Now you and I are old enough to remember this situation, but obviously the Bengals passing on Bill Walsh as their head coach has got to be one of the worst franchise moves of any team in NFL history, right?
Well, Jake, if you look at it, because he wants all those Super Bowls. He reinvented the NFL with the West Coast offense. He took it to another level when he left Cincinnati, but he didn't go right to the 49ers when the Bengals picked Tiger Johnson. He, took a year off, went to Stanford, coached there for a couple years, and then he decided to, go to the NFL and become the head coach of the 49ers. But at that time, Tiger Johnson was one of the most respected coaches in football. So the Bengals at the time thought they made the right choice. Obviously, it came back to bite them in the butt. A lot of what ifs there. What could have been? What could have been? What could have been if Greg Cook didn't get hurt and he worked under Bill Walsh? Bill Walsh might have been the Bengals coach until '82. And they could have had 3 or 4 Super Bowls maybe because Bill Walsh loved Greg Cook. But you're right. That's going to go down as one of the biggest what ifs in Bengals.
So before Jake goes, do you think Bill Walsh became who he was because we let him go, or would he always been Bill Walsh?
I think that is a good question. I don't really know if that's the situation or not, but I don't know. I don't know if that's the situation or not. That's tough. That's tough. I mean, I think Bill Walsh I think he was pissed the Bengals didn't choose him, and that's why he went back to college football. And he obviously had the last word in it because we couldn't beat him in Super Bowls when it mattered. So and then obviously speaking of Super Bowl, Stanley Wilson has got to be a name we throw out there, right? Amon, a guy you and I,
that's a big time ring of sadness. Yeah,
big time ring of sadness. Go ahead.
He was a great player. He really was. He was a solid football player. Unfortunately, he just had the chemical dependency issues. I think, honestly, I'll say it. I know the 49ers dominated us that game, but I think Stanley Wilson could have been a big difference. I really think he would have helped the team out. So many what ifs. It wasn't a talent issue with him. It was just bad choices.
And I do think I wanted to say this about the Bill Walsh thing too, because Les brought this up too. If Bill Walsh was the head coach, would he have drafted Joe Montana as a Bengal? A lot of crazy what ifs. I think that Bill Walsh thing is rough, Mon. I'm not gonna lie. I have thought about that my entire life. I think the Bill Walsh thing is rough. I know Tiger Johnson was respected, but
the first West Coast offensive quarterback was in Cincinnati. That was Virgil Carter, because Bill Walsh started the West Coast offense there, because when Greg Cook hurt his shoulder, they didn't have a quarterback. So they had this young guy that was really short, didn't have a big arm, so he invented the West Coast offense there. But yeah, you know what? It's going to go down as one of the biggest what ifs. But there's so many other Bengals. Billy Price. I mean, we could name a crap load of them that just didn't pan out. Marvin Cobb was a number one pick in 1980. They got cut the next year. When you have a number one pick in the draft and you cut him the next year, I think the Bengals had that. They did that 3 times.
Yeah,
it's horrible. That's horrible.
And go back to Stanley Wilson thing real quick. I know we got to go here, but I want to go back to Stanley Wilson real quick. When you hear Bengal players talk, Mon, you talked about this off air. You hear a lot of them talk about Stanley Wilson and the difference he would have made in that Super Bowl. That was a nasty, nasty backfield that the Bengals had with those guys, and losing Stanley Wilson. I mean, you saw how bad offensively the Bengals played. It was atrocious. How bad. Jim Breach, I've said this all. If the Bengals would have won that Super Bowl, Jim Breach would have been the MVP. That's how bad the Bengals offense was in that Super Bowl. Losing Stanley Wilson was absolutely detrimental to this Bengals offense. Remember, he had 2 or 3 touchdowns in the playoffs. He had 2 or 3 touchdowns in the playoffs.
Boomer was hurt. The last 7 games of the season, Boomer was hurt. So the Bengals became very run heavy. James Brooks, Ickey Woods, and Stanley Wilson were running the ball. I mean, there was one game they had 3 100-yard rushers.
Yeah.
And it's just they became a run-heavy team, and they needed Stanley Wilson to be that third person in the Super Bowl. But are we doing our 4 pick? Are we doing 2 each, Eric, or 4 each?
Well, let's do 2 each. Before, just one last that just popped into my head. Horrible. Cordy Glenn. Traded for Cordy Glenn. Starting left tackle, took on $75 million in contract.
Listen, the Bills
play a year.
Listen, the Bills got us. They got us good because they also, what was that guy's name? Preston Brown. Remember Preston Brown? Oh God! Do you remember when the?
What about John Jerry? What about John Jerry, the guard they got for 1 year? He was out of football for 3 years, and they brought him in to play guard.
They were excited about Bobby.
It's like the ring. This is the ring of bad decisions, not the ring of sadness. It's a ring of bad decisions.
All right, let's go ahead and get into our final picks. Mon, why don't you go ahead and give us your 2? Then Jake can give us his 2. If they happen to overlap, we'll
choose a consensus.
So
hard.
Okay, I'm gonna go. I already named these 2, but when you're a very high draft pick and you get cut the next year, that's really bad. Even Cedric Ogbuehi made it for 4 years. But Pete Cook and Freddie Childress, high draft picks, didn't even make it to year 2. That's my ring of sadness, those 2. Sorry, Dan Coates. We'll get you next year.
Okay.
Dan's not coming on the show now. Thanks, Mon. Had that lined up for next week.
Oh, Dan. Poor Dan. We'll get you next year. That was good, Mom. I'm gonna go I'm going to go with two quarterbacks. They were both taken in the first round, third overall, and that's Akili Smith and Jack Thompson. I think, and I'll tell you why, because those two draft picks could have altered the Bengals' history. It really could have. And when you, first of all, Akili Smith draft again, Mike Ditka offers the Bengals 9 draft picks, and they turn it down to take Akili Smith. That alone altered the Bengals' history. That gave us the lost decade, guys, or not the the beginning of the next the 2000s or whatever. That was just the icing on the cake for the lost decade of the Bengals. So I'm going to go Akili Smith. And I'm going to go Jack Thompson again. Jack Thompson, the Bengals used a 3rd overall pick on this guy with Ken Anderson on the roster and passed up on, let me find it again, Dan Hampton, Kellen Winslow, Joe Montana. Instead, we get Jack Thompson, the 3rd overall pick in the 79 draft. That, again, who knows if the Bengals don't put together a dynasty without, not taking Jack Thompson. So I'm going to go Jack Thompson, and I'm going to go Akili Smith. Those are my first 2 inductees to the Ring of Sadness.
That's good. Those are very good ones. You can't argue with
Archie,
that.
Archie, I'll get you next year, Archie.
Yeah.
Listen, there's some great news, Bengals fans, for this. Is the Bengals Ring of Honor every year they can add new people 5 years after people get finish their career. Well, we're in the era where the Bengals are making all the perfect decisions. So as long as we get 10 years away from that 2021 draft, there will be no more Ring of Sadness because it's all good decisions. Everything is perfect. 7 Super Bowl victories in a row. The Ring of Sadness shows will be over. Right?
Hey, listen, I agree. I 100% agree. Listen, no, I do. I agree. And sometimes things come back full circle because don't forget, in 2017, when the Bengals took John Ross, guess who else was drafted that year? Mr. Trey Hendrickson, the guy on Mon's wall, our leading sack guy right now. So it came back full circle with Trey. Hopefully we get some more full circles coming back to us very soon.
And on that note, we have to be grateful for every bit of pain that we endured because everything led us to Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase and Super Bowl victory in New Orleans. So it was all perfect. We won't have to worry about any of these therapy shows again.
All right, so we have let's go. We got Akili, Jack, and you put in
Pete Cook and Brady Childress.
Yeah, okay. So Childress, Cook, Thompson, and Smith are our first inductees to the Ring of Sadness. All right, guys, that is another edition of the Bengals Pulse. As always, if you like this podcast, make sure you like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. Make sure you check us out on all the podcast platforms, Apple, Stitcher, Spotify. Follow Mon on Twitter at TheFireMon. Follow me on Twitter at Coach Jake Owens 9. Follow Eric on Twitter at eFlash with 2 H's 88. Follow the Cincinnati Podcast Network on Twitter at Cincinnati Pod. And as always, follow the Bengals Pulse on Twitter at Bengals_Pulse9 on Instagram. The same without the at Bengals_Pulse9. And as always, if you like this podcast, make sure you give us that 5-star review. We very much appreciate that. Check out all the awesome podcasts right here on the Cincinnati Podcast Network. He is Mon. He is Eric. I am Jake. This is the Bengals Pulse. Hoo day, Bengal fans. We will see you next week.
See you guys.